My house is haunted. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, I'm haunted. My body is haunted. Recently, my cat, my family member, Newt, passed away. Quick, unexpected, irrevocable. One moment, he was purring on my partner's chest as we lay in bed, petting him after we returned home from visiting family at Christmas time. And the next, a heart attack struck, and he fell between the two of us. Yet, the moment of his body falling into the crevice between us and into his final, impenetrable silence is not what haunts me. His absences. Newt's was not the first death in my life, but he is the first person to die who is actively a part of my day-to-day life. Distance did not diminish grief or love, but they were not ingrained in every aspect of my life as Newt was. My tense is in transition. My fiancée and I work from home. Our three lives were intertwined. Every morning, Newt would wakes her up, sharing their special time together over breakfast. He sits on her lap as she works.
I did not see him coming and he just jumped in my lap. Say hi, Newt. Yeah, I know he's got stuff to say.
Or curled up on my office floor. He follows me downstairs, still begging for treats or asking to play. We'd find him in sunbeams. He curls up in our laps while we play video games, sits at the table while we eat. At night, he lies in bed with us, purring on her chest as we both stroke him to sleep. He lives still, written into our bodies. I still check chairs before sitting, instinctively leaving space for him that he no longer needs. My partner hums the song that she sang as she fed him breakfast. My index finger still remembers exactly the rhythm of his favorite chin scratches. I still brace for the weight of his body on my chest every morning, like an alarm clock that will never ring again. It's strange how life becomes an archive in the fabric of our behaviors, etching specters into our neurons, a ghost of who they were, living on in our movements, even when they disappear. Even as my mind knows he's gone, my body still expects him around the next corner. Except he isn't. My body is an archive of a life that no longer exists, each movement a fading catalog of Newt's presence. And as my body adjusts, the patterns slip away, leaving a hole in my heart where he used to be. Does he die again as they fade? How do I keep him alive when even my body begins to forget? When we talk about archives, it's easy to imagine something neutral. An old library, a cold room, a place where the past is simply kept safe for us to study and trust without question. climate-controlled, carefully labeled, protected. Archives are often treated like sacred spaces, where history lives, where truth is preserved. But archives aren't neutral. They're made of choices. Choices about what gets preserved, what gets written down, and, more often, what gets left out. Behind every document is someone who said, "This story mattered." And just as often, someone else who said that story didn't. These choices aren't accidents. They're patterns, systems. Sometimes the silence in the archive is louder than what's written there. That silence is what is known as archival silence. Missing records, missing stories, things intentionally left out of our collective memory that leave a gap that if you look closely, you can see and find. Understanding this, an archive to many starts to feel less like memory and more like a wound. Colonialism doesn't just take land, it builds systems. It sorts and defines and limits. And the archive becomes a tool for this sorting, preserving the voices of those in power while casting all others simply into data points. Grief, love, fear, joy, those don't make it into the record unless they serve the record keeper. Whole lives fall through the cracks, not because they were small, but because they intentionally were made not to fit. And what doesn't fit the classification can be ignored. Scholar Sitiyama Hartman calls this exactly what it is, the violence of the archive. I first learned about Hartman through author Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, where she cites Hartman's essay Venus in Two Acts. In that piece, Hartman sets out to find first-hand accounts of American slavery written by Africans themselves, and consistently finds very few. Specifically, she searched for traces of a girl named Venus, a young black woman murdered aboard a slave ship coming to America. Venus does appear in the archive, yes, but only in the margins of other people's stories. She's listed in a legal indictment against a slave ship captain tried for the murder of 2 black girls. She's noted in the ship's ledger, and in the journal of an overseer who describes having sex with her the night before her death, framing what could have only been rape as something romantic. His view, his voice, is the one that gets preserved. All this is there in the archive, the ledger entries, the legal documents, a man's flowery language of what he did to her. But Venus herself, her voice, her thoughts, her story, is missing. There are no words from her, only words about her. Like Venus, so many of us will not be remembered by history, not as people, not in our own right anyways. We may live full lives, feel deeply, and yet still end up as just a simple note after enough time has passed. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with anonymity, life should not be lived simply for individualized legacy, the specific way in which many of us will be forgotten is important in and of itself, because what gets remembered and how is never neutral. Venus herself remains in the archive, but not as a person, but instead as a record of violence, a body transformed into evidence, a backdrop for someone else's power. As Hartman writes,
"One cannot ask, who is Venus? Because it would be impossible to answer such a question. There are hundreds of thousands of other girls who share her circumstances, and these circumstances have generated few stories. And the stories that exist are not about them, but rather about the violence, excess, mendicancy, and reason that seized hold of their lives, transformed them into commodities and corpses, and identified them with names tossed off as insults and crass jokes. The archive is, in this case, a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history. Given this, it is doubtless impossible to ever grasp these lives again in themselves, as they might have been in a free state."
The asterisk of Venus's life isn't just a footnote. It's a placeholder for all that was erased, It marks where a person once was, but only in terms of what was done to her, how she was consumed. Venus does appear in the archive, but not as herself, but as property, as evidence, as consequence. And more painfully, we will never know who she might have been in a world where she wasn't defined entirely by the violence of slavery. We will never know her full story on her own terms, but we know there must have been one because we see evidence of her existence there. The archive doesn't just record that violence, it replicates it, framing her entire life through the lens of domination. This is the logic of colonialism. It doesn't just require land or labor, it requires bodies to disappear into someone else's story. It needs a Venus to exist only so that another man's name, another man's trial, another man's power can be documented. It takes disrupted lives and turns them into justification. It transforms brutality into legacy and violence into vision. It builds monuments to great men while everyone else becomes the asterisk that explains how they got there. This is the logic that upholds the entire colonial archive. It's not just about forgetting, it's about creating a specific version of memory, one that flattens the complexity of lives and cultures until they only serve to illuminate the so-called brilliance of those who replaced them. Colonialism doesn't simply conquer land, it fabricates the story that nothing meaningful was ever there to begin with. The word archive comes from the Greek word archeion, meaning house of the ruler. Ownership permeates the very concept of whose stories are preserved. Archives crystallize power, with archivists deciding which lives are remembered and which are left to fade. This is the violence of the archive, a brutality not of neglect but of intent. Erasure is an act of domination, a claim that a life, a culture, a story was never worthy of remembrance. The archive does not merely reflect the past, it shapes the present, deciding whose humanity endures and whose we choose to forget. So when something is missing from the archive, we find a silence, the question we must ask is, who owns the house? Western colonialism isn't just a project of conquest. It's a framework for deciding what counts as history and who gets remembered. It's built on the assumption that European culture isn't just a culture, but the blueprint for civilization itself. If a society doesn't follow that model, if it doesn't have writing or nation-states or institutional hierarchies that mimic European forms, it's treated as if it exists outside of time, in the past, as if it is primitive, fresh, empty. This belief is foundational to how colonialism justifies itself. If history only begins with written records, with formal governments, and a visible ruling class, then cultures that preserve memory through oral tradition or ceremony, kinship, or shared land stewardship are made to disappear. A land without history becomes a land up for grabs, a blank page waiting to be filled. We see the logic of colonialism playing out in brutal clarity today in Palestine. The foundational Zionist slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land," reframed colonization as a return, as rightful inheritance. It was echoed by early Zionists and their Christian imperialist allies as a justification for the displacement of Palestinians, positioning the creation of Israel not as conquest but as redemption. The land was not seen as lived in, loved, or remembered. It was framed as empty, dormant, and awaiting its true, quote-unquote, inhabitants. From its inception, Israel was shaped by the ideologies of Western European nationalism, born from 19th and 20th century colonial logics that linked blood, land, and statehood into a single myth. The nation became a project of racialized belonging, where legitimacy was tied to an imagined past and secured through archival and physical domination. The Zionist movement adopted this model, constructing a national history rooted in biblical claim and settler myth while actively erasing the people that were already there. Palestinians were cast not as a people with memory, culture, and land, but as an obstacle to the story Zionists and Israel as a nation sought to tell. Palestinians' very existence had to be erased, physically through displacement and military violence, but also archivally through historical denial and spiritually through the severing of ancestral connection, all so that a new narrative could take hold, one in which Israel was not a settler project, but the inevitable fulfillment of history. And when Palestinians resisted over the decades, they were not remembered as people defending home or family, but as obstacles, terrorists, rebels, statistics of disorder. Palestinian history, when they were recorded at all, were rarely treated as legitimate. State archives privileged Israeli voices, military reports, court records, demographic studies, Jewish history, while Palestinian testimony was treated as unreliable or unverifiable.
Entire Palestinian villages were razed, their names erased from official maps. The Nakba, the mass displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians in 1948, were rarely taught in Western schools for decades. Its memory was preserved primarily through oral history and intergenerational storytelling of Palestinians, traditions that colonial epistemologies had already deemed suspect. Even Palestinian presence is constantly redefined. Citizen to refugee to Arab Israeli to illegal settler. Terms imposed from the outside, meant to fragment identity and strip away belonging. It's an archive built to contain and control how Palestinians are seen and categorized, dehumanized and seen as disruptive to the work of linear history, of progress, of natural order. Erasure happens not only through bombs, but through paperwork, through illegal classification, through maps that stop naming what was once there. Since Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza escalated in 2023, this strategy has become even more brutal. Civilian infrastructure in Gaza, universities, schools, libraries, and museums, have been systematically targeted under the pretense that they were housing Hamas. Gaza's architecture and its archives, its history, are being deliberately destroyed to make it seem as if Palestinians were never there to begin with. It's an attempt to make it a land stripped of context, wash away the blood that was spilt there, and bury the culture beneath rubble so that settlers can arrive and claim it as theirs, unchallenged by the past. It's the same logic that should be familiar in the United States. When Columbus arrived, he didn't find emptiness, he invented it. Despite tens of millions of indigenous peoples and tribes living across the continent with complex societies and long-standing histories, he described the land as wilderness, untamed, waiting. This narrative of an empty land destined for European exploitation gets entrenched over centuries. It becomes not just the folklore of colonization, but recorded truth. Textbooks today still teach this version of history, as author Jason Stanley exemplifies by this passage from an American textbook that vastly understates the near 72 million indigenous population of the Americas at the time of Columbus's landing.
Most native settlements were small, scattered, and often impermanent. So thinly spread across the land was the North American Indian population that large areas were virtually uninhabited, with whispering primeval forests and sparkling virgin waters. Perhaps 1 million Indians dwelled in all of the present-day United States at the time of Columbus's discovery.
That's how colonization begins, by pretending there's nothing there to steal, but simply to take. And that lie gets repeated, not just in textbooks, but in the archive, in maps that redraw territory, in language that frames resistance as disorder, and in schools built to make the next generation forget who they are.
We have long since known that the physical body and the concept of the self are entangled. Your mental health can drastically affect your body, and in turn, changes in your body affect your internal self. Physical abuse and trauma can affect memory, for example. So, if my body is changing in the absence of Newt, that means who I am is also changing. I don't yet know who I am becoming, yet I know a change must come. Death is irrevocable. My body's motions and memory change. It is now haunted by a specter whose connection is now gone. Time and my body will change me. As my body changes, that means I change. Who am I becoming? Since Newt died, I've found myself reflecting on a scene from the series finale of Reservation Dogs. The show is deeply rooted in the lives of indigenous teens of the Muskogee Nation, one of many distinct tribes across what is now known as the United States, and the show explores the intersection of community, culture, and loss within it. The very first episode of the show begins in the shadow of tragedy, right after the suicide of a close friend of the teens, and his absence throughout the series becomes a haunting presence, a ghost in every frame, binding the characters together even in their grief. The show also features numerous scenes of the characters talking to their ancestors, as if their ancestors are living, breathing parts of their current present, even if they never knew them. But it's the series finale's opening scene that I keep thinking about. Willie visits her aunt Hochti, who is imprisoned within the machinery of the U.S. prison industrial complex. She does so to share that Fixico, someone dear to both of them, recently passed away. But Hochti doesn't see Fixico as truly gone. She takes a bag of chips, placing one to represent Fixco in the center and scattering other objects around it to symbolize the people within the community around Fixco. She takes a chip out of the bag and places one on each member of the community. Each chip carries a piece of him, his knowledge, his teachings, dispersed throughout the community. Fixco may have died, but he hasn't disappeared. He lives on in everyone that he shaped.
And all this, that's how community works. It's sprawling. It spreads. What do you think they came for when they tried to get rid of us? Our community. You break that, and you break the individual.
If you break the community, you break the individual. The ties that hold people together through connection, history, and time, sever them, and you sever the self. Reservation Dogs lays bare the lingering violence of colonization, portraying not just its aftermath, but its persistence. The scene unfolds in a U.S. prison, a grim monument to the systemic violence inflicted on Native communities. The United States, Canada, and other countries rooted in European colonialism typically incarcerate Native people at nearly twice the rate of white people. This staggering disparity is no accident. It's rooted in the same systems that weaponize the so-called war on drugs to devastate black communities. For Native populations, drug convictions become a tool of a broader strategy, a war on a people and a war on a community. The prison industrial complex doesn't merely cage individuals, it severs them from the bonds of connection, history, and care that form the foundations of resilience. By isolating the individual, it seeks to fracture the collective, leaving communities vulnerable to further erasure. Perhaps one of the most violent ways to break a community is to erase its history and culture, even from those who are part of it, severing access to its past. Episode 3 of Reservation Dogs' final season explores the haunting legacy of Christian missionary schools, institutions funded by the U.S. government to forcibly assimilate Native children across many tribes. These schools weren't merely tools of violence, they were weapons of cultural annihilation. Thousands of children were taken from their communities, had their hair shorn, they were stripped of their language and their identity and their autonomy. They were beaten, starved, and forced into manual labor. Those who survived carried scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, etched by the violence of this forced assimilation.
The school's motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Consequently, ours was to kill the Indian in the child.
Kill the Indian in the child.
The missionaries imposed ideologies of racial and spiritual supremacy, rooted in white supremacy, framing indigenous ways of life as savage and inferior. They sought to replace communal traditions with European hierarchies of power, property, and profit, foundational ideologies that would later form the backbone of capitalist exploitation, as well as had been the backbone of much of colonialism. These schools were crucibles for colonial domination, where children were reshaped into vessels for a script designed to erase their humanity and sever their ties to their communities. But what sadly surprised too many people is that the last school closed in 1997. This isn't some distant memory. There are people alive now who grew up in these schools.
My name was number 65 for all those years.
Just a number.
Just the number, yeah. 65, pick that up, stupid. Or 65, why'd you do that, idiot?
What does that feel like at 6 years old to be called a number?
Well, I think that's where the trauma begins. Not just the physical abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, and worst of all, sexual abuse.
You were sexually abused?
Yes. I think that's where my anger began as a young boy.
The forced assimilation of children through missionary schools was but one part of a broader strategy to obliterate indigenous communities and secure the colonizers' control over not only their bodies, but history. This is genocide by definition. The goal wasn't merely to harm individuals, it was to obliterate entire cultures by ensuring the next generation would no longer carry them forward. Break the community, and you break the individual. By erasing collective memory, the colonizers sought not only to shatter bonds, but to eradicate the possibility of even imagining a different script, one rooted in resistance, connection, and self-determination. The archive is no neutral repository. It is a ruler's house, where power dictates whose stories are preserved, whose bodies are shaped, and whose lives are erased. In my life, I've sometimes felt an inability to articulate who I am. I'm queer and trans in a society that hides the history and vocabulary of our community from all of us, queer or not. But even without the words, every queer and trans person feels the truth of who they are deep down. A lava building inside your heart, burning everything it touches, and finally, a need to erupt in pureness of self. Judith Butler, though, also describes gender as performative. This is distinct from saying gender is a performance or unreal. Instead, gender is
a constructed identity, a performative accomplishment which the mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and perform in the mode of belief.
In other words, humans create concepts that we then enact, emphasizing the act with our bodies, thus making them real. When we say, "I pronounce you husband and wife," for example, there's no magical linking of person to person. The act of people treating the bond of heterosexual marriage makes it real through our collective performance of it.
If my body still performs the actions of Newt still being here, does that mean he's still alive? So then, gender too is but an act we perform, thus making it real. Our society, however, by hiding the ability to perform our gender in ways outside of that which it relates to us as natural from our birth, attempts to control our ability to create these new performances, new realities. We are instead told to play out a script cataloged in an archive before we were even born.
The act that one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that has been going on before one arrived on the scene. Hence, gender is an act which has been rehearsed, much as a script survives the particular actors who make use of it, but which requires individual actors in order to be actualized and reproduced as reality once again.
We put on the same play over and over and over and over again. So, ourselves that should blaze outward instead turn inward, a searing fire that hollows us out, leaving behind only the shell of a puppet, moving through the motions of a reality that was never ours to inhabit. It isolates us, killing us quietly, denying the chance to perform the singularity of our being to those around us, to not allow us to share ourselves with our community. Without that stage, without the interplay of authentic selves, we are stripped of the power to carve patterns from the raw material of community and connection. Instead, the patterns we leave behind are borrowed, etched by society's hands, rehearsed and repeated until they settle like dust, constructing a fragile house of pretense. As I write this, I wonder, what of the lives we did not lead? Does a person die when the performance they were meant to enact is stolen from them, or do they never truly live at all? If the stage is seized and the lines erased, was their existence ever real? Do they linger as an archive of silence in their own soul, a haunting testament to the selves we were denied? Or do we never even know that the silence was there, a part written out of the script of the story, never even conspicuous by its absence?
I do not own this house. I do not know who lived here before, whose lives, whose hurts, whose joys were held within these walls.
Fascism is colonialism turned inward onto the lives those the colonial state once claimed it was building a society for. When there are no more lands to conquer, no more peoples to displace, the machinery of erasure turns on its own, disciplining the very bodies it once promised to protect. The tactics remain the same, only now the violence is justified not in the name of empire, but in the name of preservation of culture, of nation, of order. Europe only began to condemn fascism because its violence was directed at white bodies, the same violence that had long been accepted, celebrated, when inflicted on colonized peoples. Yet fascism doesn't arrive from nowhere. It emerges from a colonial culture already fluent in forgetting, in mythologizing its past. It builds up on the lie that colonialism sold, the notion that there once existed a pure, stable culture built upon a verdant, empty land. But now, as fascism tells it, something essential has been lost or corrupted by outsiders or degenerates, by change. Fascism promises to restore that imagined past, to protect it, to make sure that the future keeps looking like the present. Or more accurately, a mythologized past. An endless cycle. But there is nothing to return to. That past never existed except through domination and erasure, nor too then can a fascist future. And when the colonial archive can no longer contain what it tried to bury, when memory of the truths and cultures that were intentionally erased begins to resurface and be found by the bodies living within the colonial culture, fascism responds by tightening its grip. What was once exported is now turned inward, enforced within borders, institutions, and finally, within the self. The violence that built the empire comes home, and it mandates an erasure of all that doesn't fit its narrative in order to force its story upon the world. Western culture thrives on the story of naming and control. In the biblical Genesis, God creates everything, including man, in his image, a lesser reflection of himself, for which we must all give thanks. And in return, we are granted dominion over the Garden of Eden. We name the animals. We control them through our description. By naming them, we claim them. But in the act of naming, something is always lost. The words we give them can only encompass what we see, leaving behind what we don't, what they withhold, what they share only with each other. Our naming limits them, fragments them, and robs us of the fullness of their being. This control is embedded in our language even now, especially in how we speak about animals. We call ourselves pet owners. We tether them to us with leashes. Even in love, our relationship with them is diminished, their lives relegated to something less than ours. When a pet dies, we're told to move on, to get over it. Grief for them is diminished. Bereavement is not afforded. Their lives are seen as replaceable, commodified, and disposable. Is this what Newt was to me? Was he just another possession I owned within this house? A commodity to be cherished only so long as he brought me joy? His life limited by the language I used to describe him? Or was there something more? Something that defied the diminishment of naming, a connection that resisted the limits imposed by a culture that sees love as ownership. The term most often invoked to justify attacks on transgender healthcare for youth is parental rights. Parents have the right to dictate how to raise their child. Implicit ownership. It is their house, goddammit, and the child will live by their rules while they're living under my roof.
Let father and mother guide the conversational trend if they desire. After all, they made all this possible and may want to talk over their day with each other.
When you look at forums where parents discuss their fear of a child coming out as trans, the concerns are almost always trivial, centered on the parents themselves. What about our pictures? What about prom? They fear inconsequential moments of discomfort, getting yelled at for using the wrong pronoun, while ignoring the monumental truth of what their child is experiencing. They fixate on the imagined horrors of medical intervention, the myth of a child being pumped full of hormones, while dismissing the extensive research showing that gender-affirming care is effective, safe, and often life-saving. These parents often appeal to the sanctity of a Christian body. This is how God made you. This is how I made you. They treat their child's identity as a rejection of divine and parental authorship.
I was born into the wrong body, Mom.
Your body's absolutely perfect. I know you don't see yourself, but I do.
No. I'm a boy. I know who I am, and I want to be who I am, and I want you to love me for that.
Honey, I love you.
You love the girl that you gave birth to.
God gave you this amazing body, and you want to change it.
Parental authorship. I gave you your name. I chose it because it was beautiful. But they never ask, what if the name my child has chosen is even more beautiful because it is? a name that describes them in their totality as best as language can encompass such things. It is a declaration of truth on our terms, a triumph of self-recognition. Some of these parents say they would rather have a dead child than a trans one. This is not love. It is control. These parents do not see their children as people, but as extensions of themselves, performances of their desires. To have their child deviate from the script they have written feels like a rejection of themselves. Death becomes preferable to a transformation because death is final. Death is ownership. In death, the story remains theirs. They get to put a dead name on a dead child. As queer theorist Lee Edelman argues, heterosexual culture depends on the notion of the child as the future, a deferred version of the self, endlessly projected forward.
Growth continues, and this baby will become a full-grown boy or girl, and eventually a father or a mother, thus continuing the cycle of human growth.
Such self-evident one-sidedness, the affirmation of a value so unquestioned, because so obviously unquestionable, is that of the child whose innocence solicits our defense, is precisely, of course, what distinguishes public service announcements from the partisan discourse of political argumentation. But it is also, I suggest, what makes such announcements so oppressively political. Political not in the partisan terms implied by the media consultant, but political in a far more insidious way. Political insofar as the fantasy subtending the image of the child invariably shapes the logic within which the political itself must be thought. That logic compels us, to the extent that we would register as politically responsible, to submit to the framing of political debate and indeed of the political field as defined by the terms of what this book describes as reproductive futurism. Terms that impose an ideological limit on political discourse as such, preserving in the process the absolute privilege of heteronormativity by rendering unthinkable, by casting outside the political domain the possibility of a queer resistance to this organizing principle of communal relations. I argue, then, that we might do well to attempt what is surely impossible, to withdraw our allegiance, however compulsory, from a reality based on the Ponzi scheme of reproductive futurism.
Children are treated as vessels of a parent's legacy, the endless perpetuation of an identity imprinted upon the next. But this is not a quantum entanglement across generations, it is an act of colonization. It is denial of the child's and generations' autonomy, their right to carve their own path, to name themselves, to be themselves.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad.
It's the same logic that sees a child not as a person in their own right, but as a vessel of legacy, something to be shaped, categorized, and made useful in relation to an idealized past. Both the child and colonized subject are denied their autonomy in service of someone else's narrative of progress. This is the root of a violence against trans youth, the refusal to see them as separate beings with lives, identities, and futures of their own. But it is not just the violence against trans youth. To sever someone from the archive of their own story, to deny them the ability to pass on a piece of themselves into the extraordinary palimpsest of life, is the only true death. And causing it, a terrible cruelty. Queer lives have a particularly unique relationship to archival violence. Colonial systems depend on the idea that gender and sexuality follow a fixed natural order, one rooted in European norms. The heterosexual family was designed to stabilize patriarchal power, to regulate inheritance, and to ensure that women's bodies could be controlled as vessels of bloodlines, labor, and property. Marriage became a mechanism to transfer wealth and land. Reproduction became a way to secure national or racial features on into the future. and anything that disrupted that structure, non-reproductive sex, gender nonconformity, queer kinship, was often labeled as deviant, threatening, or disposable. Colonial narratives rely on this myth of stability. It tells a story in which rigid gender roles and heterosexuality are the universal by default. But in truth, many indigenous and non-Western societies have long held fluid, expansive understandings of gender and sexuality, understandings that had to be suppressed in order for colonial power to take hold. Queerness in this framework then isn't just erased, it's criminalized, medicalized, or made invisible so that the colonial fiction of a stable, orderly past can remain intact.
Gay people who were sentenced to medical institutions because they were found to be sexual psychopaths were subjected sometimes to sterilization.
Queer people, along with numerous marginalized groups in the United States, were often forcibly sterilized to prevent them from having children. Children who might grow up in another context or culture, who might come to understand the world in a way that challenges dominant norms. It's why the right wing today so often attacks queer adoption rights. Historically, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women have been disproportionately targeted by forced sterilization programs, with one study finding that over 25% of Indigenous American women of childbearing age were sterilized without consent by the 1970s. Adoption by queer families, especially BIPOC queer families, is similarly policed, restricted, and pathologized, treated as a threat to the racial, cultural, and gendered order that white supremacy and cis heteronormativity seek to preserve. It's also why white trans men, who are seen as cis women by a patriarchal and white supremacist society, are so hyper-focused on per their potential for losing their reproductive ability, and thus needing to be saved from trans ideology.
She'll be stuck instead in some sort of hellish limbo, having lost her femininity, but not having replaced it with anything like masculinity. You are not allowed to leave this behind and strive for a more whole and complete life, one lived in harmony with your biological nature rather than at war with it. You're not allowed to do that because he's not doing that.
This is why queer history so often disappears from the archive. Not because we weren't there, but because our existence disrupts the narrative. The result is a long history of people whose lives challenge those norms, even from within the dominant colonizing culture, being written out or rewritten to fit. People who love differently, live differently, people whose stories were flattened, sanitized, or reclassified to make them legible to straight cis colonial eyes. Alan Turing, for example, the gay man who helped win World War II, was chemically castrated and driven to suicide, his queerness downplayed or ignored in the telling of his monumental achievements for Western culture. William Shakespeare, whose love poems to a man and brazenly queer wit shimmer in his works, often has his potential bisexuality erased, smoothed over by heterosexual readings. And these are only the great men of history that our stories allow us to remember. How many queer people who weren't notable by society had stories left untold, unshared? The erasure is deliberate. In 1933, the Nazi Party burned the Institute of Sexology, a groundbreaking center for transgender and queer scholarship. Hundreds of pioneering texts, works, and stories that could have deepened understanding and nurtured futures for trans people were reduced to ash. This act set back transgender academic studies by decades, robbing generations of their past and their possibility. To destroy a people, they burned the works that bore witness to their humanity, tearing entire threads from the fabric of history. The point isn't just to erase us, it's to erase the idea that anything else is possible. That's the violence at the heart of the archive, not just the names it leaves out, but the world it builds in their absence. A world where life follows one path: man, woman, marriage, property, legacy. A world where bodies are sorted, tracked, inherited. Where deviation isn't just punished, it's made unthinkable. It's the telling of a singular story by erasing all others. One clarification that I want to make is that when I speak about the queer community as a generalized whole in this video, I don't mean to collapse our many diverse identities into a singular narrative, or suggest we all experience queerness the same way. There are countless ways to be queer. I'm using queer here as a broad political term, one that names not just identities, but marginalization. It includes those who are targeted for not conforming to heterosexual or gender norms, especially within the structures enforced by patriarchal European colonial cultures. And even more so, queerness can be even more expansive than sexuality or gender issues. Queerness, in this sense, is not a fixed identity, but a position shaped by power, by those who are excluded, erased, or punished for simply existing as themselves, within a society that regulates specific identities. This is something I keep trying to get people to understand when I talk about queerness. Queerness isn't about gender. It's not about sexuality. It's the crack in the story that says there is only one way to be human. Queer people arrive in every single culture that tries to crystallize power, that tries to tell one story. In a culture where people are allowed to live multiple ways, there aren't people who are seen as queer. Across time, what today calls queerness has been an integral part to the fabric of many societies. So when we understand queerness as that, queerness then becomes the memory that we have lived otherwise, that kinship doesn't require blood, that desire doesn't have to serve empire or birth more citizens or fit a census form. They call us unnatural because we remind them that their systems are the fiction, that their archive is the one built on a mission. Queerness is not about who we fuck or how we dress. It's the refusal to make peace with a world that would rather we didn't exist at all. Queerness is a reminder that no matter how many histories, stories, cultures get erased, the human heart constantly remembers them all, deep inside, and fights to bring them into the future, to tell a new story. It's the reminder, terrifying to those in power, that something else has always been possible. That it still is. This is why so much of queer history is not taught, not even in modern-day America where I live. I was nearly 20 before I learned about the uprising at Stonewall, a story that could have given me the words for myself if I had encountered it sooner. Yet even Stonewall often eclipses the Compton's cafeteria riot of 1966, wherein drag queens and trans women in San Francisco's Tenderloin fought back against police harassment. These stories of resistance stand as defiance against a house that seeks to dominate us, to control our bodies and lives. No wonder they're not told by the house that gets to determine the archive. And so, like many colonized cultures, queer history often survives through oral tradition and community storytelling, passed hand to hand, voice to voice. But even there, a silence lingers, because in the United States, as with many places, so many queer elders aren't here to tell it to us. The AIDS crisis ripped through the queer community, stealing a generation of mentors, friends, and storytellers. It wasn't just a virus that killed them, it was neglect and hatred. Ronald Reagan left us to die, refusing even to name the disease as thousands perished. The government's indifference ensured that those who could have passed down their wisdom, their resilience, and their stories of survival were silenced. My connection to my history was severed before I even had the chance to know it existed. So many queer people today never got the chance to understand what that pain really meant for our community. I didn't, not until years after coming out. Not until I was working at The Advocate, a decades-old LGBTQ magazine. One day, I was sitting with our photo editor, an older gay man, and I pulled out an issue from the 1980s from a shelf. And he started pointing at faces. Friends. People he'd loved. People who had died. He told me about the endless funerals he had to attend. The loss after loss after loss. And I just listened. And I could see it on his face. The weight of all of it. Still there. Living today. That was the first time I truly understood the AIDS crisis. Not as statistics or headlines, not as a story told through numbers in a classroom, but as something personal. As part of my history, my culture, my community as a queer person. Something passed on not through archives, but memory. Through him. It was the first time I felt what it meant to have history kept from me. What it meant to suddenly feel connected to something I hadn't even known I'd lost. Without these elders, an entire generation is left to piece together fragments of even our recent past. Archaeologists sifting through ruins, but the ruins are inside us, our hearts colonized by the same systems that erased our ancestors. The void left by their absence becomes a place where society implants its narratives, forcing us to perform roles that reinforce its dominance. We internalize the scripts of shame and isolation, turning the erasure of our history into a weapon against ourselves. If you sever us from our history, you colonize our very sense of self. If you break the community, you break the individual. Today, trans lives are under siege. Bathroom bans, healthcare restrictions, and efforts to erase us from public life aim to tear us apart. Not just from the world, but from each other. These attacks seek to leave behind a void, an absence, an empty space filled only with a screaming silence, where people used to be. And though we fight back as we always have, community now feels distant, fractured by isolation. Our homes, our suburbs, our boxes of identity have grown stronger than ever before. With Trump elected, the violence will get worse. We've already seen it. The attempts to kill and genocide and erase trans history, our shared community and connection. The Trump administration has worked relentlessly to erase any mention of trans and queer people from public record, scrubbing government websites, deleting LGBTQ resources, stripping away decades of research about us. Like the Nazis destroying the Institute of Sexology, torching early studies of gender and sexuality, they are again trying to wipe us from memory. Even Stonewall's National Monument, meant to honor our resistance, has not been spared. Trans people were quietly removed from its language. More recently, even the word bisexual has disappeared from it. The government site meant to commemorate a riot against police violence, and the very same government now attacking us yet again, is now sanitizing away the very people who made it possible. A deliberate rewriting designed to fracture us, to erase the multiplicity of identities that stood together at Stonewall, and turn that legacy into something narrow, palatable, and divided, to convince us we were never in it together. Mainstream history often treats queerness as a recent phenomenon, something that only emerged in the past few decades because of the success of liberal humanism and modern social progress. This framing erases the long global history of queer existence and resistance. It presents our visibility in today's culture not as a result of centuries of struggle, but as a gift granted by an enlightened society. The same revisionism appears in how right-wing groups like PragerU frame the history of slavery in America, casting emancipation as the benevolent act by white liberals, rather than something hard-won by generations of black resistance and solidarity.
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War.
These narratives serve a deeper ideological function. They idealize the past as pure, orderly, even divine, a Garden of Eden closer to God, a time before disruption. In doing so, they strip the past of its violence, its trauma, its human cost, and with it the possibility of learning or reckoning with it. And as such, inequality today is recast not as a product of historical systems or material power, but as evidence of natural difference. Black people aren't poor or incarcerated because of systemic design, but because something is inherently wrong, lesser about them. Queer people aren't marginalized because spaces were never built for our bodies and lives. We were just not meant to fit. This is how oppression sustains itself, by making the unnatural feel inevitable. And this is also how queerness becomes coded as a sign of societal collapse by the right wing, how DEI becomes framed as overreach, and how equality itself is reframed as excess. But the truth is, the past was never as clean as these stories suggest. It was full of conflict, resistance, survival in the face of oppression. If we pretend the present is healed because we mythologize a past that never was, we lose the ability to understand where harm came from and how to undo it. This reach towards a future horizon, where queerness is not marked as deviation but embraced as part of a shared humanity, is not unique to the queer community. It echoes across all marginalized peoples who seek to retrace the fractured, buried, and stolen stories of our past in order to imagine a future not defined by erasure but an awareness of the fullness of our historical pains that have been kept from us all. As Hartman argued in Venus in Two Acts,
as a writer committed to telling stories, I have endeavored to represent the lives of the nameless and the forgotten, to reckon with loss, and to respect the limits of what cannot be known. For me, narrating counter histories of slavery has always been inseparable from writing a history of present, by which I mean the incomplete project of freedom and the precarious life of the ex-slave, a condition defined by the vulnerability to premature death and to gratuitous acts of violence. As I understand it, a history of the present strives to illuminate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, to write our now as it is interpreted by this past, and to imagine a free state not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing.
The rulers of the archive, the architects of erasure, would still seek to shape our stories to fit their designs. Queer people, black people, women, indigenous folks across the world, our existence doesn't signal decay. It proves we've always been here. Always. We need to tell our stories now more than ever, because the archive that only recently pretended to include us was always ready to erase us again. And now we see just how quickly it will. Reclaiming our stories is not simply restoring them to the archive, but creating new spaces where they can breathe freely, unbound by the narratives imposed upon them. Our history is not lost. It is alive in the fight to dismantle the colonization within us. To resist is to remember. To reclaim is to imagine anew. One of my favorite books ever, The City in the Middle of the Night by trans author Charlie Jane Anders, takes place on a tidally locked planet, one half always facing the sun, the other trapped in perpetual night. The only survivable area for humans is a narrow strip of twilight between both sides, and it's there that the remnants of human society try to survive, having long forgotten where they came from or how they got there. Even the main city on the planet, which is divided by class surveillance and fear, is shaped by the delineations of a ship that brought them to this planet, itself having been segregated by the class divisions of Earth before it, though no one remembers this anymore. One of the protagonists is a queer working-class girl named Sophie, who is cast onto the night side of the planet to die by her city's fascist police, punished for covering for a minor crime her upper-class fellow university student she had a crush on committed. If her crush had been caught due to her status, she would have only been nominally punished. Sophie, just wanting to protect the girl that she has feelings towards and not truly understanding these differences in class, instead faces the full brunt of the police force, who, considering that she is lower class and has committed a crime of taking money, is left out to die. But she doesn't. She's saved by the planet's native species, alien beings that live on the night side of the planet, beings the colonists never bothered to understand. To the colonizing humans, they were just savage, mindless beasts, leaving the planet itself empty, a harsh place to be tamed. But in truth, these beings are not what humans assumed. They're not primitive nor unintelligent. They're just different. They're collective. They carry memory across generations, each individual body holding pieces of others, so that when one dies, their memories live on in their community, a hive mind of sorts. They are an archive, but not one made of documents or institutions. They are a living archive. They remember every loss, every joy, every mistake. They embody their history. The most haunting moment in the book comes when Sophie meets their leader, only to learn that this leader is long dead, having passed centuries earlier. And yet, they're still here, not symbolically, not metaphorically, actually here, sustained through the community's shared memory. They speak through others. They are remembered so fully, so continuously, that they still participate in the present.
I witness the slow progress of history, the changing shape of Galette society, long before humans arrive. A huge presence comes among us sleepers, and this new arrival looms over all of us. Somehow, I can tell this is the leader, or more like the magistrate of the Galette. From the way the other dreamers lower their pincers and focus their minds, the magistrate turns to each of us in turn, searching our hearts and examining our stories with tendrils that slip past our skins and bones and all the walls we might have tried to build around our souls. When the magistrate comes to me, a powerful mind reaches all the way inside my mind and takes stock, and there's a long, terrible pause. I start to worry. Maybe I've failed, been found wanting, or made a mistake. I panic, even in my sleep, twitching and contorting, but the magistrate just reaches all the way inside of me and pulls out a childish memory I half forgot from grammar school. Back when Mark tried to snatch my hand and I ran away from him, and then I was startled by the freedom, the safety of not being courted. I feel that memory rise to the surface, coming to define me, but also becoming known to the other Galette through our shared sleep. But then I realize this leader, whoever she is, has been dead since long before my grandparents' grandparents were born. This visitor has a shared memory kept alive in all of us. I start to wonder if the entire government of the Galette is made up of ghosts and dreams.
I still think about that passage of the book, because to me, this is what queer memory feels like at its best. A living, breathing act of resistance, of collective history. Like the alien Galette in the story, marginalized history is not about linear progress. It all is happening at once. Things that have happened long ago also just happen, are yet to happen. The pain is immediate, and the pain is yet to come, and we remember it so we can see the horizon, what we are going towards, because we already see it. We already live there. We already live in a place where we are not queer, where we are not oppressed, and yet we are still walking there at the same time. It's what colonized people have always tried to preserve, even when everything else was taken. That's why in shows like Reservation Dogs, we see Indigenous youth speaking with their ancestors, not as distant, frozen figures from history, but as present guides offering wisdom for the challenges of today.
I'm not gonna be here forever, so...
The moment we're born, we're gonna die.
No, I mean California.
California! Oh! Yeah, that's where you're gonna go. You're gonna run away, head off west, dreaming big. They all just want to run away. We are all just running away.
The past is not gone if we carry it with us. We don't need the approval of state archives or institutional records to remember who we are. We are our own archive. We hold each other's stories when no one else will. We speak to the dead because they are still speaking through our voices, our choices, our survival. That's what colonization always tries to sever. Not just people from land, but generations from each other. Not just bodies from history, but from the continuity of care that makes survival meaningful. The memory of who we are that helps shape the possibility of who we could be.
Making my film Identities, which is a queer film, was one of the hardest yet most beautiful experiences of my life. It was a communal act of creation. Every conversation about sets, lighting, line delivery, or music wove us together, building something greater than ourselves. And through this process of making art, I glimpsed a version of myself I wanted to explore further, but I also realized that this community that we were building was only going to last in this formation for just the time it took to make the movie. The form that community took while working on that film will never exist in that exact alchemy again. And it filled me with a sadness. But during the process, one night I sat with a crew member who had Indigenous heritage. They gently pushed back, explaining that for many tribes, stories are brief. They end so that new ones can begin. White culture, they said, is obsessed with telling the same stories over and over and over again, as though repetition could erase the traumas those stories carried or deny the need for something new, as if the story just kept going around in a circle.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
In that repetition, that loop, they reminded me, is its own kind of violence. It seeks to control history by claiming ownership of the past, forcing it into an endless loop that denies the possibility of transformation, saying that it has always been this way and it will continue to always be this way. Western culture has long feared endings. We obsess over eternal life, From myths of the Fountain of Youth to comic books continually going on and sci-fi characters who die and return reborn, even Jesus, the superhero character of his time, whose story is at the center of Western identity, dies only to return, eternal and singular. His resurrection claims ownership over our sins, our gratitude, even our history. Supposedly, his return erases our traumas and the scars of the past, offering redemption through his singular triumph over death. But this erasure is its own violence. It demands we endlessly retell his story, centering it above all others as proof of the power to overcome an ending. Our cultural narratives follow the same pattern, circling back and retelling the same archetypes, the same heroes with thousands of faces. It is a framework that worships ownership and control, denying the new, erasing the unique, and subsuming every voice into a singular, eternal narrative.
There's a kind of intimation of immortality in that. Do you see what I mean?
This is the violence of the archive. To overwrite multiplicity with sameness. To deny the possibility of endings, and in doing so, to erase the stories that fall outside the circle. To say that we can never become anything more than what we are. That violence weighed in my mind as I stood in the queer-owned studio where we filmed Identities. Months of planning had gone into crafting a sleek sci-fi set. We built it, lived in its vibrant energy for a week, and then tore it down in a few hours. And when the studio was empty and every member of my crew had left, I walked through the space, overwhelmed by the ghost of what we'd made. My body, after that week, remembered the life and community that we created there. But now every trace of it was physically gone. And I stood there. And I cried. Mourning what was now gone, but also celebrating what we made. Its ending wasn't an erasure, but a transformation. The motion of that set and community lives on, not as a repetition of what came before, but as part of a new growing thread in the tapestry of queer existence. I by no means am saying that Identities was some monumental moment in queer history, but it was part of it. It was part of that community, part of that story. The people who built that movie existed before and go on after, influenced by what came before, and hopefully influencing what comes after. And it's by no means a coincidence that a picture of Newt sits on a desk in one of the film shots. He is there, written into the history and the archive of the story. Every single person who saw the film carries a piece of him.
Ezra Reeves, one of the actors that starred in Identities, recently directed a play in San Francisco about the Compton's cafeteria riot. I wish I'd been able to see it, because it was a play that was about showing and preserving a history that has been often forgotten, making it live and breathe today through art in the very city where it happened. And while the production was running in May 2025, members of the San Francisco trans community returned to the site of the original riot to reclaim it, not just as a space, but as a memory of our history and culture. Protesters climbed onto the roof of the old Compton's building and raised a trans flag there, declaring it as a site of our history, of our resistance, of our survival. The building is currently owned by the GEO Group, a corporation that owns numerous private prisons. The same systems that targeted trans people on that corner now profit off the mass incarceration of Indigenous, Black, and Brown and queer communities across the country. What was once a space of trans resistance is now a monument to carceral power. And so, we return, we retell the story, we reclaim our space, we refuse to let it be forgotten. Because remembering what was before can be good, we glance to the past, not to freeze it in place, not to return to it, not to create it in our nostalgic memory like fascists do, not to calcify old power, but to remember that something else was always possible. We hold onto our history so we can remember that we can build something new, not constantly loop back in a circle of domination and power. This is the legacy of the queer community that we constantly remember together. From Identities to Ezra's play, to all of the resistance and art made by queer people and throughout history that all connect together.
Endings are inevitable, And to resist them is to cling to the violence of ownership and control of the present now. To say what I have now is what should always be, and to keep others from changing because you're too scared to change. But in accepting them and letting them make space for something new, we resist the violence of the archive. Creation is fleeting, but its ripples endure, defying erasure and shaping a future that is not just a repetition of the past, but something unimagined and undeniable that remembers its scars.
I do not own this house, and I did not own Newt. When I first went to the shelter to find a cat, I was overwhelmed by the possibilities. There were dozens of cats meowing, purring, all vying for my attention. How could I choose any one of them to love? Then, as I was sitting down to pet another cat, a paw reached out and tapped me on my neck. I turned, and that's when I first saw him. Sitting in a patio tunnel, his eyes met mine. Kind, but not demanding. Hopeful, but not pleading. At 10 years old, Newt chose me. For 5 years, he lived with me across several apartments and even several states, becoming a part of my daily life and rituals. And despite living in this house for only 6 months before he passed away, it became a home to him, my fiancé, and me. Now it is haunted. Not by his ghost, but by his absence. The absence of the small rituals that defined this space with him in it. His sunbeam spots, the warmth of his purring, his weight on my chest, the way he announced himself with a bound. All now voids. This house, however, is not mine. I rent it. And when I leave, Newt's hairs will be vacuumed, the scuffs painted over, our entire presence here erased. The archive of our lives here, Newt's life, will vanish, leaving only a line in a ledger on some landlord's books. Newt, like so many stories, will become an asterisk. The violence of the archive is a violence against the collective body, a shared humanity that binds us. Humanity is a constant striving for identity, but when traces of culture's existences are erased, the possibilities carried by human hearts vanish, leaving a void in our hearts where connection and understanding should have thrived. This violence is intimate. It's as if a body is erasing its scars, and in forgetting, we perpetuate harm, repeating cycles of erasure because we have not learned to carry our hurts. Trauma has become woven into our daily life that we hardly even notice its weight. We're constantly asked to smooth the edges of our pain, to disappear, to the point where even our suffering feels like it isn't ours to hold anymore. Genocide, cultural erasure, and historical rewriting are not only attacks on targeted peoples and traditions, but crimes against all of us. But resistance to erasure exists, not just in defiance, but in preservation. In the 1980s, as queer people were abandoned by their government and shunned by a society that left them to die from AIDS, they created a home in each other. They carried the memories forward, even as their loss diminished them. The AIDS memorial quilt is a symbolic testament to this. The quilt became a symbol, each stitch meant to be a refusal for a loved one to disappear into silence. Together, the squares formed something greater than they would have been alone, declaring that queer lives and love endured in defiance of all else that tried to erase them. It transformed grief into connection, proving that even when bodies are taken, the connections remain stitched into memory, defying the forces that try to silence them forever, to cut them out from the human cloth. But I've been thinking a lot about how mainstream conversations about preserving LGBTQ history, about fighting for it, are often centering on our inclusion in American institutions, about how we've been folded into the national narrative and how we're now being pushed out. Take, for example, the outrage over the removal of Harvey Milk's name from a U.S. Navy ship during Pride Month this year.
A group of LGBTQ veterans worked for years to get a naval vessel named for Harvey Milk because he was a naval veteran, and they were successful. And it was a huge win for the community. And so many of us are so proud that Harvey's name is on a vessel. And so it is just despicable and unbelievably painful that this administration, in its quest to erase LGBTQ people from public life, not just trans people, gay and lesbian people too, that in that quest, they are now doing this horrible thing during Pride Month. It's disgusting.
It was framed as a brutal attack on queer rights. And yes, the intent behind it by the Trump administration was to be cruel. Is the erasure of a queer activist name from a military vessel, even one meant to honor his service during the Korean War, the symbol of queer liberation we should be rallying around? There's something unsettling about framing our belonging around proximity to state and military power, especially when those very institutions have long upheld colonial violence and have even been used against us. So many queer fights over the last few decades in the United States have centered on our inclusion in structures like marriage equality or our ability to serve in the military. And this is not me saying that we shouldn't fight for equal rights, but why is inclusion into these structures that were never made for us treated as the ultimate marker of progress? Why is our queerness only made legitimate when it can be aligned with empire? Ryan Coogler's Sinners has become one of the biggest films of 2025. At its core, Sinners is about history. Who holds it, who loses it, and what people will do to reclaim it. The most moving scene comes midway through the film, when Sammy, a black guitarist, plays blues music in a juke joint built by and for the local black community. His music, we're told, has power, not just because it echoes the past, but because it pierces the veil between life and death.
There are legends of people born with the gift of making music so true it can pierce the veil between life and death, conjuring spirits from the past and the future.
So when he plays it in this moment, spirits from both the past and the future, from the marginalized communities that are present, begin to gather. Black ancestors, Chinese immigrants of the Mississippi Delta, and even those yet to come, like black rappers, are all drawn to this place, pulled through time by the force of Sammy's song. A way to heal, the movie says.
We heal our people, and we be free.
But Remick, a centuries-old Irish vampire, watches the scene unfold with jealousy. He cannot feel his own culture anymore because of his vampirism. He can't reach it, can't hear it. In an act of desperation masked as generosity, he slowly turns this black community into vampires, hoping Sammy will join them, so Sammy's music might help Remick connect to his lost Irish past.
You're the one I came for. I sensed you. I want to see my people again. I'm trapped here, but your gifts can bring them to me.
But even as Remick forces his new followers to perform a rousing rendition of Rocky Road to Dublin, his longing remains. He argues for cultural exchange.
This world already left you for dead. Won't let you build. Won't let you fellowship. We will do just that. Together.
But what he really wants is assimilation. Consume what isn't his in order to fill the void of what he's lost by taking from others. The film uses Remick to explore a truth about whiteness and colonization, how assimilation weaponizes shared suffering. The Irish were once colonized themselves, oppressed by the British for over 700 years, stripped of language, faith, and land. And when many Irish immigrants arrived in the United States, many initially lived in solidarity with similarly oppressed black communities, sharing neighborhoods and working-class struggles. But over time, that solidarity was intentionally broken. Many Irish communities were offered the chance to become white in order to break solidarity with black communities, offered a chance to join the police force, or were asked to break solidarity with black laborers during labor movements. Remick is that history made undead. He's introduced on the run from vampire-slaying Indigenous Americans, another culture of resistance, but he survives by turning inward, trying to cling and steal someone else's culture. he has become what he once hated, a colonized subject who now upholds the very systems he once ran from, trying desperately to reclaim his own history that has been stolen from him. Near the film's end, as one of the film's protagonists is about to be drowned by Remick, begins to pray, a final grasp for salvation.
I want your stories, and I want your songs, and you won't have mine.
Our Father, which art in heaven.
Christianity, forced upon both black and Irish communities as a weapon of empire, echoes hollowly in this scene. Christianity was imposed to overwrite, to erase both Irish and black cultures. And when Remick mentions he finds comfort in the prayer, he also admits that the words were never his.
Long ago, the man who stole my father's land forced these words upon us. Oh, I hated those men, but the words still bring me comfort.
But it's all he has left. When Remick dunks Sammy in the water, it isn't mercy, it's a baptism, attempting to take his life so they can both feel closer to a God that was never for either of them. Sinners becomes a film about how colonialism fractures solidarity, how the loss of history can turn marginalized people against each other until the only thing left to hold on to is someone else's suffering. And as I sit thinking about that, I realize that there is a contradiction in me, in my life. I am colonized within as a trans person today, and I colonize without. As a white person, I inherit privilege born from systems that devastated Indigenous peoples and others, both in the past and today. This house right here is on land stolen from the Luape and countless other tribes that were erased by settler colonialism in this country. Yet, as a trans person, my body knows colonization differently, shaped by forces seeking to control, define, and erase me, and erase my connection to other human beings, to shove me in a box, to shove me in a home, to just be a cog, a function. And this dual awareness, a colonizer's legacy and a colonized life, reverberates through the loops of history, through the archive of the body, and it leaves me grappling with guilt and grief, anger and rage, and a desire to do something, trying to reconcile these intertwined truths, the harms I inherit and the harm I endure. The conflict shapes how I navigate the world, carrying both completely and resistance within me. The conflict shapes how I navigate the world, carrying both complicity and resistance within me. My transness is a site of internal colonization, where power seeks to sever me from my body's truths. For Indigenous people, colonization is an external force, violently erasing histories, cultures, and lands, while imposing control over collective memory. Both forms of colonization assault the body, the space where our stories and connections reside. We are severed from ourselves and each other, told to exist as oppressor and oppressed in an endless loop in our own souls and to each other. I say all this not in an attempt to overwrite or claim the pain of others as my own, or to try to focus only on guilt or my complicity. What I'm trying to say is that their trauma is not mine, but it is a trauma I must connect to, because the violence of this house's archive, the effort to erase and overwrite us, it links us all. It's all the same fight. The assault on queer lives, the genocide of Palestinians, the genocide of trans people right now, the erasure of Indigenous peoples and genocides against them throughout history are threads of the same tapestry of oppression. As I was editing this video, there was a lot of discourse that came up about certain white trans women, especially in the leftist YouTube sphere, not speaking up about Palestine. I'm not going to unpack everything that was going on with that here. That's a much longer conversation. But I do want to sit with where I exist within that. I am a white trans woman living in the United States. I live in a country actively funding and arming the genocide in Gaza by Israel. But I also live in a body targeted by the same state, one that's under legislative attack, denying our healthcare, making us into scapegoats. I exist at the intersection of two truths. I am endangered by the empire I live under, and I'm also shaped by the privileges it gives me. That contradiction doesn't cancel itself out, it just complicates everything. Like Remick and Sinners, I know what it means to feel disconnected from my history, from my community, from my culture. What it means to reach for something that might bring it back. But unlike Remick, I have to resist the urge to fill that void with someone else's culture, someone else's pain, someone else's story, to try to assimilate into the larger whole, and thus contribute to the harm it causes to others. Because the truth is, white trans women, myself included, have caused harm. Trans figures like Sarah McBride, who have publicly supported the IDF and also work within the U.S. government.
Hi, I'm Sarah McBride, the member of Congress from the great state of Delaware. And today and every day, I'm proud to stand with U.S. allies, with U.S. democratic allies, including the state of Israel.
Show what happens when whiteness overrides any sense of shared struggle. When we stop asking what histories we've inherited and start pretending we are always meant to be here, even as we are being erased. And I see how this discourse, even within leftist spaces, has caused solidarity to erode. The US and Israel have both worked hard to fracture solidarity between queer people and Palestinians. They sell us a story where queer liberation and Palestinian resistance are at odds, where queerness must align with the West in order to survive. It uses the language of Islamophobia to say queer people will be killed by Palestinians, and thus we need to destroy them.
We wondered if the people who were celebrating gays for Gaza might want to learn what happens to gays in Gaza. Hamas throws them off buildings or drags them behind motorcycles. Hamas and the Palestinians look at gays and Jews about the same. They want to do the same to them that the Nazis did. They talk about them the same way. Yet some in the gay community in America are so blinded by their hatred for Jews, they side with the Palestinians who want to kill both gays and Jews.
It offers a false choice, safety in empire or annihilation outside of it. But that's a lie built on the same colonial logic that harms us all. It's the same logic that says queerness only matters when it's legible to power, that says history only counts when it's written by the state, that says there's only one right way to live, to worship, to love. But this is not just a queer versus Palestinian issue. I see it everywhere lately. Everyone is scared and frustrated and angry and burnt out, and everyone's just moving to just care about their own fights and getting angry at others who don't try to understand theirs, rather than linking together in solidarity to try to overcome friction, to overcome moments of tension, because there will always be tension between oppressed groups, in trying to figure out how our struggles are interlinked, shared, and while not the same, are fighting the same problem on different fronts. Because queer and Palestinian liberation are not oppositional. They are the same fight. Both are about refusing the systems that say we must erase ourselves to survive. To fight for queer liberation is to fight against colonization, and to fight against genocide is to fight for queer lives. These are not separate struggles, but one fight for humanity against the forces of erasure and domination. The blood and pain of Black people, Indigenous people, Palestinians, the disabled, the poor, the queer, the trans. And children inherit this violence daily. Their futures shaped by scars of a past that they bear, even as they are told that it never existed. The pain in my body echoes the collective loss. How might this pain awaken me to the violence of the world? How might it deepen my understanding of the grief etched into humanity's collective whole? We forget the wounds of the past only to reenact them again and again. To erase culture, a history, or a body is to silence the stories that hold us together, to enable us to commit violence again. To resist this erasure is to remember, to feel the scars that they demand we forget, and to tell the buried stories. Resistance protects what must be remembered, ensuring the stories and connections that sustain us are not severed. It begins with connection, healing the fractures. Our strength lies in unity through multiplicity, in refusing to be broken apart at our seams, and to remember to stitch them together. Resistance is about the fight to ensure there's something left to remember. You can silence us, but we will speak with one another. You can take our bodies, but you will never steal the home that we have made in each other. We live on in the archive of our community's hearts.
I want to understand how the suffering in our stories and in our bodies is both individual and collective. How unspeakable and shareable pain is coupled with pain and trauma in the body politics or the collective body, making pain and suffering necessarily shared, thus creating a story that must be told.
My fiancé and I are leaving this house soon. We can no longer afford it because times are great at the moment, and we're moving to a better place, at the very least. I will miss the haunting of this house. I wrote the first draft of this video 2 weeks after Newt died, and writing it was an attempt to try to help me express my pain. And it did help, but I almost didn't film this video. But now, as we prepare to leave, I feel the pain of losing him all over again, as though I'm losing him a second time. I'll no longer see the places where he lived, where he existed. This house was never truly ours, and I will likely never return here. In the culture I was born in, places like this house are meant to forget us. We're supposed to be interchangeable, replaceable, cogs in a machine. And my time spent here will be erased, overwritten by whoever comes next. The landlord will pay money to clear away every single trace of me, every single hair of our lives and Newt. And frankly, if our culture had its way, when I die, I would be forgotten completely, served my function, especially because I will never be a great man of history. The places that held Newt will become spaces where, in the world's memory, he never existed. I think about the archive of the body, of relationships, of love, and how these things are finite but enduring, stretching across time like a chain passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. The foundations of this world are built on stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen stories. Colonization and systemic racism sever the threads of memory, burying history under layers of violence and rewriting narratives, indigenous languages, black traditions, and so many other cultural archives that have been targeted for destruction. Their absences leaving wounds not just for those communities, but for all of us. These acts of erasure rob humanity of its fullness, silencing truths that might have reshaped our shared existence. Yet, these communities persist, resisting erasure through storytelling, art, and a fierce commitment to remembrance, even as the systems around them seek to obliterate their archives. I've experienced it in my own life. When I was young, I had a cat named Miss T, who was my first teacher in love and gentleness. She and I were inseparable. She purred in the crook of my arm every single night. She loved to chase ice cubes that I dropped from the freezer. Miss T taught me kindness, caring, and empathy through her love. That's what she gave me, and I hope I gave her that same love. It's the same love I gave to Newt. Despite never meeting, a piece of Miss T lived in Newt through me. Her love became eternal, carried forward, just as Newt now lives in me. The love I hold, and the small but indelible ways he changed the way I live my life. Communities work this way too. They are living archives. The trans community, my community, is one where we teach each other, remember for each other, and carry names and stories long after the people they belong to have left us. Even when our names attempt to be erased by our parents, or those who say that the names that we chose are not our own, we remember them within our community, saying them every single year on Trans Day of Remembrance, to remember those who are no longer with us. But our archive is always under threat. The house was never truly ours, and this country reminds us constantly that it isn't ours either, that it was never built for us, merely, at times, is willing to accommodate us, and rarely then. I think of my trans siblings, my queer family, and the many others who will die too soon because of what this country is going to do over the next few years, and has been doing over the past few, and has been doing over decades and centuries. Names we will have to carry, stitching them into the quilt of our hearts so that they are not forgotten. How many more will we lose before their time? How many more empty chairs and empty beds and unmarked graves will we grieve? To erase a life is to commit violence against more than just that person. It's to sever threads of connection, to silence the truths and possibilities they carried. This is the violence of the archive, the destruction or rewriting of memory to break the bonds that make us whole. It is a violence that we are asked to enact on ourselves, smoothing the edges of our pain, erasing our histories, and disappearing. Each act of forgetting tears holes in our collective humanity. And yet, even in this unbearable weight, we fight. We fight to hold on to every life still burning, every soul still shining. We resist erasure by remembering, by holding on to the stories buried beneath the layers of violence. The love we share, the connections we weave, these are our acts of defiance. They are the foundation of our community, a home made of memory and care, beyond the reach of those who would destroy it. The house was never ours, but the bonds we formed within it are. Life is not measured by what we take or keep. It's measured by what we give. Our actions, our words, our love. Through these, we live on in others who will carry a piece of us into the future, just as we carry those in the past. Community is an archive of life stretching across eons, rippling through time. A life erased leaves ripples of silence. But a life remembered, carried forward, sends waves of connection through the universe. This is how we resist the violence of the archive, by refusing to forget, by holding on to each other, by ensuring that no matter what is taken, the connections that sustain us endure, that we pass on the love that we had, the actions and the performances of love that we etched into our connections between us, that goes on to the next. Newt lives in those who come next, and those who come next live in Newt. My body is haunted, but my heart is whole.
Hey, so originally that was going to be the end of the video, but a few things have happened as I was editing this that I kind of at least want to just touch upon and draw out a little bit more and kind of speak about where I'm at right now, because I have a feeling that it's going to reflect a lot of how all of you are currently feeling. This is Kipo and this is Jetta, and Kipo may go exploring in just a second. But yeah, it's actually been several months since I filmed the bulk of this video, so I wanted to at least let you know that we have moved into a new place. We've settled in nicely, and our kitties are doing rather well. In fact, this is actually the cat tree that Newt used to use, that I bought specifically for Newt, that our kitties now use. So again, community goes on. And also you're meeting Smog now too. We have a lot of kitties. We like kitties. So hopefully seeing new kitties and new life and new family and new connections helps bring home the whole idea. Aaron, my fiance, and I really miss Newt quite a lot, and we hope we bring the love that he taught us to these guys. But speaking on that point, I just kind of want to be frank with all of you, because there was one thing I touched upon in this video that wasn't the main point, but I think needs to be drawn out a little bit further, just considering the state of the world right now. If I'm being entirely frank with all of you, it has been very, very, very difficult to create these past few months. Some of those reasons are very, very obvious. Looking at just the general state of the world and what's happening in the United States specifically, and also in Gaza against Palestinians, it's been hard. I'm going to be frank, I have been in and out of depression these past few months. Yeah, sometimes it's been really difficult to even like find energy to get out of bed. Part of the reason I'm even able to do that is because of these guys. But one thing I touched upon in this video and kind of was ultimately the big kind of point that I was kind of trying to subtly get at, but I really want to make more explicit, is how our communities are all connected with each other. And part of what has been deeply depressing me lately, and I'm not going to get into specifics because there's numerous examples, is how fragmented a lot of our discourse has become, specifically in spaces that are fighting back against encroaching fascism. I'm not necessarily here to take sides on any currently discourse that's going on right now. In fact, I'm sure by the time this video comes out, a new discourse has been created. It's been going for months over numerous different things about how just there's been a lack of ability in our conversations, and I'm not blaming anybody for it, but a lack of ability to work across lines of difference, to sit with uncomfortability. There's actually a really great article by someone named Freya, who I'll link down below, that I really encourage you all to read because it kind of touches upon a lot of the feelings that I'm feeling right now. Given where we're at right now, everyone is stressed the fuck out and just trying to be heard, because none of us are being heard, and we're all hurting, we're all terrified, and we're all angry, and that's what fascism does. That's what colonialism does. That's what genocides do. They hurt everybody. It's fucking incomprehensible to the human heart to understand. We can't take that in. It's impossible. It's too much for anyone to hold, and to have all of this ongoing at once, it's crushing. But I look out at what a lot of this has caused in online spaces specifically is a lot of vitriol at each other and not a lot of grace. And some anger is understandable at certain figures, certainly. But a lot of this polarization and heightened discourse and overstating harm in some cases when it comes to just online discourse specifically, I think ultimately just helps fascism by fragmenting us and not allowing us to create conversations. And so that's what's been really depressing me, because I haven't really known how to tackle it. In fact, I'm sure even saying a lot of the things that I've said in here will get taken into certain contexts or different discourse, even though I'm not talking about anything specifically. And that's not my goal here. My goal here ultimately is to say it's been difficult for me to create, and what I want to try to do going forward is focusing on content that is trying to build, trying to make good things, trying to build a world. Imagine a world where we can create something new, where we can try to work across lines of discomfort and uncomfortability and tension, and try to hold on to each other and give each other grace, and not letting go of accountability for harm, but let that harm try to be restorative. And then on top of that, fight back against fascism, colonialization, the ongoing genocide against Palestinians, the attacks on trans humanity, and the genocide of trans people happening in the United States. That's what I want to focus on, building bridges and fighting back, not this fragmentation. But it's hard. It's hard to have the energy to do that. It really has been very difficult. So I hope you all will be patient with me. I'm working on stuff. I'm trying to work on stuff, but it's just been an emotional drain. But I just want to say all of that because that's what I want to try and give to everybody. Hope that we will connect with each other and try to build, but most importantly, work to try to imagine new worlds, not just replicating the old ones or performing the old ones, but trying to imagine different ways that we can live and survive. And this, unfortunately, transitions me, I should be better at transitions, into the capitalism part of this, which is, money's been hard lately. Also, my partner and I, we are trying to see if we can figure out how to immigrate out of the United States. We've been looking at various different places, and that costs a lot of money. So if you do want to support me, support my work, support what I do here, Patreon does really, really help right now. It actually really, really means a lot. It helps me feed myself, my partner, these wonderful kitties who are lovely and amazing. So yeah, if you can support me over there on Patreon, that would be phenomenal. I always hate doing that bit because it's the capitalism part of it, but we live in capitalism, so what are you gonna do? Love you all, and I will, I will try and get this before I go off, but just to end out, my two kitties, Smog and Kipo, are now licking each other, so if you want two little gay kitties loving each other, if you want more of that content, support me over on Patreon. But with that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. Ah, damn it, they stopped. I think Aaron has some footage of them being little gay boys, so I'll put it up here at the end. Mock at 80, Carrie Ellen Foss, Veronica Fox, Blue, Mary Mello, Barbie Ann Rounds, Sarah Montgomery, Iron, Stephen Clenard, Christian Hurst, Jazz Miss, Jade Stark, Daniel Prone, Randy Thompson, Alex Miller, Lily Blanley, Samuel Howard, Dark Archon, Auntie Kate 808, Vincent Ellington, Tara Rose, Amada Kaiba, Miranda Ketia, Atheistic Snail, Zane Schuschler, Michael Wonet, Super Desi, Meadow Whisperer, Joseph Dewey the Gnome, Sammy Joe Retro, Daihatchi, Chris Showers, Lily Gray, Angela Hendricks, Rose Conley, David Demma, Katie Starr, Todd Verling, Cade Kitten, Shep Alderson, Dominic Noble, Cleo McKeever, Anthony Evans, James Krivda, Brian Walters, Villager 138, Farengato, Kalarina Bonbon, W. Randy Ed, Patrick Green, Kevin Frogtag, Gumunder Stephenson, Sean Silver, Daryl William Sandifer, Flyan Conda, Epsilon is greater than, Ryan Hunter, Jamie, Casey Kyle Hampton, Troy Stull, Al Tantivi, Teague Wilson, John Witherby, Alexa Burris, Erica Barrica, Care On, Casual Observer, Sarah Lemero, Patrick Crompton, Crit Mullen, Jason Knott, Stephen Richardson, Hope Jason Tuliana, Sage Zerd, Zach Prax, Ing Marie, it's Craig Lowe, Penile Sparing Vaginoplasty, Grumpy Dragon 75, Stephen Chapman, Vale Hunkinen, Damian Rice, Sasha M, Pramita Bagchi, Rosalind Bennett, Melinda Walters, Melody Ann Winters Good, White Lion, Sean Piper, Juliana Rigel, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Sarah Bystam, Carrie the Neuroturtle, Tyler Edwards, Sophie's Dead Name Walking, Jordy Lucero, Richard Guderizy, Meat Popsicle, Craig and David, Luna, Laura Demeros, Celestial Dawn, Kezzy Garrett Smithinson, Alec Leigh Berry, Bruno, Tori Perez, Crit Fax, Lev Goodman, Nyan Fan, Jocelyn Ethersford, Quite Bearish, Michael Weber, Mira G, Maximilian Marks, Henry Pierce, Tom Chi 311, and Julie Werner. Adore y'all. Thank you. Mwah.